Hello, good afternoon, good morning, good evening.
Hello.
This is Luisa Bravo from
Good afternoon,
good morning,
good
from
evening.
the Public Space Academy.
Hello.
This is my pleasure today to host the first keynote lecture of the Public Space Academy. You know that we are starting this program of keynote lecturers every month throughout 2024. I'm here today with Via Viese, our communication manager for the Public Space Academy that you probably already saw in the opening, launching event of the Public Space Academy.
Yes, hello everybody. Hi, excited to have you all here today. Hope we have a nice lecture today.
Okay, before we start the lecture, inviting our first keynote lecturer, I just want to tell you that we will have some time at the end of the lecture, around 10 or 15 minutes, to answer to several questions that you would like to ask. So please prepare your questions in advance during the lecture so that we can select the best questions, because I don't know if we will have enough time to answer to all the questions. So now I would like to introduce you our keynote lecturer, who is Dr. Vikas Mehta, Professor of Urban Design at the School of Planning, University of Cincinnati. His work focuses on the role of design and planning in creating a more responsive, equitable, stimulating, and communicative environment. For those of you who are working on public space, he's a very well-known research scholar in the field. So I'm very happy to welcome him today with us. Welcome, Vikas.
Thank you, Luisa. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, because I know people are joining in from various places. I'm going to start with sharing.
We cannot hear you well, Vikas.
How about now? Any better?
Yes.
Okay. So I'll just get any better. Let me know if the audio isn't good.
Now it's fine.
So if you don't mind sharing the slideshow.
Yes.
Thank you. So it's actually very appropriate that Luisa chose that I do the first lecture, because this is actually going to cover many areas of public space, sort of different from my previous work, which was sort of diving into sort of commercial neighborhood main streets with very detailed research. This little book is based on years of work on public space, and it's in a way a summary of a lot of research that not only I have done, but of course tens of scholars from whom I've learned, with whom I've collaborated. So this little book is in fact a way to sort of explore public space, and it's a primer, and it's also in a way a progressive text. So it covers the vast territory, journeys a lot of areas of public space, and presents a panoramic view under one cover. And the hope is that it brings in lots of very interesting, disparate, sort of overlapping ideas and thoughts on public space. So let's start with how the book is structured. Really taking from the book itself. It's written as a book that you can in fact almost open on any page and enjoy a thought about public space that hopefully gets you to know a little bit about it, to think about the complexities of public space, but also then think about what are the possibilities and future lecture propositions. Before I start, I want to say that we probably all can agree that in the current sort of core temporality of public space as the locus of stimulation, exchange, oppression, and emancipation all kind of together, there is a lot of the doubts around the relevance of public space have been erased, in this time, in the last perhaps 10, 12, 15 years. We've seen public space emerge as a really, really important arena in the city itself. Um, so this is a really good time to talk about public space, to bring people into the fore to discuss this from whichever discipline or whichever field they are coming from. Many of those places obviously interact with public space, as we know. So this book is organized in sort of 5 chapters, within which there are these tens of tenets or ideas or thoughts, that's what I'm going to present today. And so it's first talking about why care about public space. The next one talks about what is public space. And then the third one, which is a really interesting one, is about the paradoxes, that it's not easy to understand, to be able to get your arms around it, because public space, interestingly, is a arena full of paradoxes. And the other two talk about what are the possibilities, and finally, what are the propositions moving forward in the time that we are in. So let's start with why care. As I just said, it's very, very clear to us that public space still matters, because it's a place where we can think about an arena to exercise citizenship, express our rights, and demand justice. As we've seen around the world, it's a place for interconnectivity, mobility, and flows, which people have now, instead of just giving up to the automobile, have challenged sort of this network, which belongs to everyone. And public space sort of is this wonderful domain with the flows. It's a place for cultivating and learning, and cultivating creativity. It's a place to nurture well-being and health, as we see people using sort of many, many public spaces for not just walking as a means of health, but actively using spaces for physical and psychological health, to display experiences that are collective and sort of shared, but also distinct cultural identities. So some of these things we kind of know, but I just wanted to summarize and see it in almost one picture in one slide, that public space has all this power. It's a place for play and to cherish leisure, and of course to sustain formal and informal economies. And finally, at this time, it's become a really important site for environmental resilience, in terms of how cities see resilience during this climate crisis. Public space is actually a very, very critical piece of that. Um, and it's a place for intercommunication and to um, express our differences in space. So picking up on some of these ideas and perhaps developing them, is that public space is a repository of memories and meanings, and we cannot forget that this is not just a place that we think of as place to go and enjoy and play and consume, but it's actually a palimpsest. It sort of builds over time and collects these memories and meanings, and that's actually visible in sort of ordinary and special events, in the rituals and the festivals, ceremonies that we might see sort of performed very differently across the world in different cultures. But it's critical to understand that value of public space. The other really key piece is that this is where, outside of our private or parochial realms, we think about this is a place with the possibility of contact with the unfamiliar. So that's one of the biggest advantages that urban life offers us, the contact and interaction with people, things, and actions that are unfamiliar to us. In a very, very simple, ordinary way, public space offers us lots of joys, whether it is being outdoors, sort of being there by ourselves, being in the company of others, enjoying nature, experimenting. It's a very simple sort of place for pleasures and delight that it offers us. So we don't want to forget that, even if political scientists perhaps might not think of that as a higher role of public space. It's actually a very critical role for the ordinary everyday citizen in everyday life. Um, Another way to think about it is that with our sort of busy lives, and for most people sort of set schedules, there is a sort of a motion of customary patterns of daily life. And public space offers a pause, a way to think about sort of this little bit of difference between what daily patterns of life offer. It's a place of visibility. So as we talked about, it's a place for experiencing the unfamiliar. And that happens because public space uh, is a place where you can be there and expect to be recognized. Doesn't always mean that that recognition is always a positive recognition, but it is a place where there is a affirmation of your identity in a larger society, and sort of the relational link you might have as a group or as an individual to the larger society. So, and that's of course made visible through many means and ways of, again, artifacts or the actions we do or how we might use public space. But that is again a key component that it makes us visible, groups, individuals, and different identities. And at the same time, it has this connecting power where the ubiquity of public space, of spaces that are somewhat similar in different parts of the globe, helps sort of people connect um, to sort of their place where they may have come from, or to the larger place that we are all in. And so it has that capacity of affiliation across different landscapes and cultures. In a very sort of pragmatic way, public space is fundamental to the needs and rights of the youth. The openness and freedom that public space offers is very critical for the development of youth, for them to be able to sort of go and have an inner reflection in this place that is outside of their family domain or a very familiar domain. But it also provides them sort of an outer exposure to be able to, in a very loose, open-ended terrain, express themselves and explore identities as well. And so I think that's again very critical in public space as a function for the development of personalities of youth. And of course, we know now that in the times that we are in, public space is really like an insurance policy. The expanse of public space has to be understood as an asset in the response to climate crisis. And I'll talk about this a little bit more in the propositions, because but this is perhaps a little bit underexplored role of public space, and it's a very tangible role of public space that we need to really understand and explore. And finally, public space in all of these things that we're talking about acts as a platform upon which many of these things can occur simultaneously. They could occur while they create perhaps even some conflicts, but it still makes this place a platform for which to have all of this occur. This is a sketch of the ghats in Banaras, Varanasi in India, where many sort of ways this public space is used. So it's just an example of showing how that is. And so in very profound, but also in very mundane ways, public space and the nature of public space actually affects us. Um, and we need to understand that and be able to explore that more. So this might be a little bit flipped, where you might think of, why don't we talk about what is public space first? But I intentionally chose to talk about why should we care about this. But let's try to, go through what is public space. So in many ways, all public space, even though we think about it as tangible, relational, and typological. It's all in many ways symbolic of how we think about the public realm. We think about the public domain, and public space sort of is a place of that physical action of that. If you think about what public implies, it opens up a lot of things for us to understand what is public space. So to many, it is open, available, accessible. It is also common and shared and collective. But we can also understand public space is what is inclusive. It's visible and it belongs to everyone. But on the other hand, public space is also something which is not my problem. It is somebody else's problem. And in other ways, it is an outside. It is where you are exposed. It is also a territory that is unknown, and it comes with some risk. And these things are not necessarily good or bad, glass half full and glass half empty. They're actually collectively both all really, really interesting ways to recognize and accept public space in the way that it is. And, in a way, we might think about that the tension between the political order, the various market agendas, the social and cultural norms that people bring to public space, the individual and group needs and desires are all visible in public space. So that's where this is again that platform where these very different sort of tensions are played out. And of course, we think about public sphere, the public domain, the public realm. Public space, as scholars have said, is kind of a geography of all of the public sphere, the domain, and the realm. So it's the physical place, and public is rooted in these concepts. I won't sort of bore you with the entirety of this, but the purpose of this is that this is an area that has been defined by many scholars in different ways, and these scholars come from very, very different fields. But then more recently, perhaps in the last maybe 20 some years, 15 to 20 years, people have been trying to actually look at how do we measure it. And those ways of measuring public space come from, again, quite different perspectives, whether these are perspectives that are purely political or these are perspectives that are political but also enter the arena of creating, managing public space. So they are on one end, they are purely social science based measures, but on the other hand, they're also measures that are considering the social science along with the design planning disciplines as well. We always need to ask, who is the public, right? Because we think about public space, it's not this one big common thing that is the public. The sort of the tacit agreement of norms and behaviors in public space that each culture has, that is based on prevailing values, it has to remain somewhat open-ended. Otherwise, it is very dogmatic, and public space is then actually constraining and eliminating others. So we need to think about always who is the public. There are many, many publics for whom this space should really work. So it has to stay somewhat open-ended. Again, I will discuss this a little bit in the end, in the last chapter. Following up in that is my observation that there is no one public. In fact, public space perhaps should be understood as public's space. That this idea of a universal, all-inclusive, balanced arena is almost unattainable because the tensions and the friction in public space actually makes it evident that this space is available to all the publics. So when we think about this as a place that is entirely balanced as an arena and all inclusive, it's probably not a very sort of full, complete, open public space, because if you don't see those tensions, it's certainly excluding certain groups. So again, as a follow-up to that is that public space is meaningful when it is more than just mere sort of small private territories in a larger common territory. Senate has talked about this. So we have to think about how this is a place where, and this is more in terms of not only understanding, but delivering public space, that it should allow for sort of private territories, group territories, but also it should be understood as a larger common territory. Then it is, uh, it's more than just the proximity. It is more about dialogue. It's more about visibility. It's more about using public space as a way to sort of enhance culture and values. It's very clear that public space is gendered space, and of course there is a lot going on in terms of fighting for women's right in public space, because historically and even as recently and in present, um, women have expressed very clearly that public space is really not women's space, and their experience is obviously very different. But the good thing is that in many cultures, again, especially in India, where the rights of women has been particularly curtailed for centuries, there is a movement in many of the cities for women to do exactly the kinds of things where the society is in fact trying to protect them from the harm in society. And so women are actually saying, we want to, in fact, get in out there. We want to walk tall. We want to sort of just walk idle. We want to explore the city in ways that we have not been. And society, in their own ways, trying to protect us to not do that. So it's a very complicated relationship of how safety is actually delivered to women in terms of public space. I talk a little bit more about that in the book. Um, and, like I think about public space, that we cannot exist without it. Everybody should benefit from it. And when it starts to get polluted, it's kind of the value diminishes for everyone. So we need to think about this as a place that is, or as a space, as an arena that is very much like sort of the air around us. It has many modalities. It presents itself in many distinct ways, and that's visible in the literature. People come to it from understanding its role as a civic space, social space, restorative space, symbolic, a space of exchange, and also a kinetic space. So the advantage of looking at it from all of these is that we are able to fully explore all of the possibilities of public space. So now we come to sort of the third component, which is my favorite, is that public space is interesting because it's full of paradoxes. It is not a static, resolved sort of arena or space. And if you think about it, that you ask, you go around, you realize that everybody seems to know what it is. And yet, when you probe, uh, none of us really know what it is. And that's the beauty of it. And I think that exists because of the paradoxes. Let's pick up a very common one, the idea of the agora. Um, it has been celebrated, at least in the Western culture, as one of the sort of a premier example of public space. But we also have to understand that it lives in a very complex paradox, that it is concurrently a space which is, which was used for democratic discourse, for politics, but also a place of exclusion. Certain groups, women, the people that were slaved, were not allowed, were not in the agora. And so it had this very interesting uh, tension, which I think about. It has a sort of very high role exhibited of public space, but also the lowest, where it's completely excluding. So we would really cherish a place like the agora, where in fact politics and sort of democratic discourse are part of being there. But at the same time, we wouldn't want parts of society to be excluded from it. We think about, acts of defiance and protest become disruptive to public space, and they, in many times, make public space inaccessible to many others. But that is the test of tenacity. When that can happen, that is displaying the endurance of public space. When that is completely curbed, it is very clear that that space is not public. That space is not fully public. It is only sort of a facsimile public space when it cannot take the role of being a place for protest and demand and political action. Of course, the other big tension is the idea of safety, that the safety mechanisms, um, they intend to make public space safe for others to use, for more people to use. But in doing so, they often create this threat that because we have all of these safety measures applied to public space, it is perhaps not safe to be there. So it's a very interesting paradox about how do we, sort of work to create safe spaces for those groups that don't feel safe there without sending the messages that this space or these spaces or this network of spaces needs this much sort of surveillance to be able to be in it. Um, there are all these zones, there are business improvement district, neighborhood improvement districts, and all of these, which are sort of, in a way, capital's mechanisms for revitalizing, for improving, for creating identity, for creating revenue, all good things. But at the same time, there are also mechanisms of privatization, homogenization, cleaning up, and sort of monitoring, and ultimately of exclusion. So this is again a very visible paradox that exists in most places around the world. Um, I try list this just to be comic in this, is that capital spaces are they will resurrect a lot of these public spaces, and they are really anchors for capital. These spaces are most of the time absolute, they're bugged, they're largely based on consumption. They sort of divide society into who is in, who is out, and they are exploitative, and they are often fabricated. You look at them and the experience in them, it's almost very fabricated. They, whether visibly or invisibly through other means, are gated, homogeneous, etc., etc. Um, this is one of the interesting things I've found, is that in public spaces, the expectation from people in society is one of the key to how we will move ahead with public space. So, on the one hand, citizens really want public space to be accessible to them, but on the other hand, what many people are expecting is also what is getting delivered by capital. Are these sort of clean spaces that are, non-political or apolitical, but they are places that are cleaned up. And that creates a very interesting paradox, because if that's going to be largely a very uh, overarching demand from public, how do we work with that to make sure that that is not swaying the way we create public space in the future? Public space is not neutral. Look around us and we find there are ways that there are sort of restrictions, whether very, very clear or subtle, that are in place. And we need to think about these, and we need to be able to question these. But my urge to, scholars and sort of younger folk who are studying public spaces to understand this, that these restrictions exist by ways of policy, or they are sometimes visible by way of sort of clear, visible sort of actions and tenets. Another interesting paradox, which many of you who are familiar with this would know, that Zuccotti Park, which essentially created the place for Occupy, one of the more known places for it, was able to do so in a way because it was not a public space. Um, it is a private space that was able to support the actions, because the public, the governance of it, could not impose the health, safety, welfare for a very long time. And that's a very interesting paradox, that the rules and regulations that we apply to our public spaces are in fact quite restrictive, in fact more restrictive than this POPs, the privately owned public space. And so we need to think about this. How do we want public spaces to be for us to be able to express opinion, talk about dissent, and ask and demand? Is this a model for us to be able to do so, or do we need to change the way we write up sort of the rules and regulations for all our public spaces? The other paradox is, of course, we want to create public space, make them accessible, but sometimes we overstimulate them. You think about, this is a picture of the High Line. I've been to the High Line several times. The last few times I went there, it was just the way you see it in this picture. It was packed with people that you could really not experience anything other than the fact that you were walking in a sea of humanity. So we need to think about how we sort of manage and stimulate public space in a way that it doesn't really become its own sort of enemy, take away all that experience. Another paradox has been talked about for at least a couple decades, that on one hand, the digital realm in public space makes us behave like in our own bubbles and sort of be just within our own world and in co-presence with the others. But at the same time, people have found through research that there is, in fact, some relational connectivity that people might have through their digital devices to others that sort of connects them to public space. So we need to think about the interaction between cyberspace and sort of the physical public space and its possibilities, and it's actually being displayed in many ways in expanding public space and in fact redefining the public realm. I don't have time to get into it in detail, but the whole Occupy movement, in fact, started with essentially, digital communication on the public sphere, and then moved into something that is physical. Last two things which I'll have to rush through. We talk about, well, all this opens up to what are the possibilities in public space. First of all, we need to understand that the city is really visible in public space. It is a big unifier, a leveler, and sort of equalizer of status. So many people from very different sort of strata can exist in public space if it is made available in the right way. But it also where people can feel the difference in their wealth, in the class, in the power. But nevertheless, it is this place that is dialogic, it celebrates the commonalities and it unites, but it also has the ability to show the difference between people. It is a place of much action. I mean, I don't want to read you the whole list, but it has to be understood as all these wonderful things that we are able to do. In the more recent times, we've seen the sort of temporary public spaces being used, being repurposed, and liminal spaces are becoming really places of experimentation and have just innumerable possibilities and promise for public space that perhaps traditional public space has been robbed of by capital. One of the interesting things is that the potential of public space, all of these things that I've been talking about, becomes visible when society is under distress. And there are lots of hidden possibilities where during that time, public space acts as a place for camaraderie, for cooperation, for education, for sharing, for writing up things, for caring for each other. And I think it's critical to understand the possibilities of public space when there is this distress, and all the possibilities seem to emerge in that. We've seen that in many of these protest movements where people have really used public space in a full array that we would never typically do on a daily basis. Public space has to be understood as a place that allows for diversity and difference, and that's kind of the reward of urbanity. And it's a place for us to be able to build and develop trust. Just one little tenet or idea in there is that what's the role of architecture in this? And public facing architecture, at least, must have a dialogue with public space and in the way that it is occupied, it has this ability to actually use public space and use the architecture interaction with them. There is a role of art, which is not about just sort of beautification, but it's also, and the way I say it is that public art, that is art in public space, has to be equally freed and burdened by the expansiveness of art and public, because an artist should be free to do what they want to express and how they want to express. But at the same time, when they are doing this in public as public art, they have responsibilities beyond beautification. They have responsibilities towards education, history and culture, and representation of community. And so public art has to be seen as that, not just a tool of beautification. Informality in public space, there is a majority of population in the world depend on informal processes. And as a hybrid space of access, agency, and exchange, public space is just wildly sort of beneficial when you intersect informality and the processes of that with public space. We have to understand that this is a place for risk and reward, and not just reward, because there is always risk in public space, but those risks are the ones that deliver reward. We need to accept that fact as we think about a good, open, and sort of inclusive public space. Finally, we talk about propositions. I know we are about 10:39, so I'll take just a few minutes. The ideal public space we need to understand as utopic public space. Now, that doesn't mean that that space exists, but we need to have that vision of public space in order to bring any public space closer to that. And I do that in this last chapter by talking about two sort of meta categories, sort of major overarching frameworks of open-endedness and systems thinking, and within which there are these 6 principles that I'll quickly go over as the propositions for moving ahead with public space. And so the first one is about environmental resilience. And if we talk about civic practice, public health and well-being, new cultural identities and social cohesion, informal economy, and then finally also imagination and play. So these 6 things I'll discuss in this last chapter and the last few minutes of the lecture. So we need to first imagine, this idea of what would a utopic ideal public space be? And can it be a place for care for the destitute and the disadvantaged? Can it be a place for novel, unusual, unexpected behaviors? Can it be a place that offers excitement through risk and novelty, experimentation, also civil disagreement and debate? Can that be public space? And in fact, we think that that is really the proof of public space. When there is difference, when there's a range, friction, when there's adjacencies and complexity, there are overlaps, there's also disorder. Those are the things that, in fact, prove to us, or should prove to us, that this is good public space. We need to think about designing for humane flows, where we are producing access that is collective and has sort of diverse representations. And this can be a very small element that, in fact, can open up public space to many, many people. We need to celebrate difference and accept public space for that difference, that it is not a space that is this generalized space for all. It is a place of difference for very different acts and different identities in one place. There are places from where we can understand how seemingly chaotic sort of public space is in fact built in very, very localized negotiations and sort of a local agency that makes public space much, much more open and accessible to everyone. Jan Gehl has talked about this idea of life between buildings, and for designers and urban designers, it's particularly important to sort of rethink, what if we drew out and thought about space between buildings and the actions, rather than the other way around, where space is a byproduct of the built form. So we need to flip this to understand that as well. Public space, to be good, doesn't need to be complex. For it to be able to accommodate all of these things we've talked about, it can be simple or complex. We need to get away from this idea of Euclidean zoning, even in public space, meaning putting all these different uses in different places in different public spaces, not very beneficial. We need to bring these together to sort of really benefit from it. Very simple thing that William White, talked about in very elegant ways decades ago. Is it sittable? Good cities are places with good public space. Great cities are places where there are lots of places for people to sit. Something very banal that many sort of architectural projects just don't seem to get, that we as human beings need shelter, and spaces that we create need to be hospitable and inviting, even with this simple sort of gestures. And then there is this idea of small change, little comforts make public space more accessible for not just simple everyday actions, but also eventually for larger actions about dialogue, being there, seeing others, etc. We need to think of public space not as these spaces, but also as networks, because networks, the web of connections with lots of linkages, they produce much, much more exchange, benefit, connectedness throughout the city, through different parts of society, different parts of different neighborhoods within the city. We need to engage the institutions, because we know that we have limited public sort of resources, and there are lots of these other institutions that actually can benefit from public space, but also benefit public space itself. We need to sort of weave an ecosystem, as many places are doing. And then finally, I think we need to experiment and tinker, and not just think about public space as finished. We need to be able to play with it, and all public space doesn't need to be clear and explicit. I'll leave you with this, that public space has really immense capacity that's only limited by our imagination. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vikas, for your presentation. I think it was very comprehensive and touched so many aspects of the complexity of public space. So really a great start for our Keynote Lecture Series. I've been following some of the comments from the chat. So if you have any more questions that you would like to ask to Vikas, so that we take advantage of his presence with us today. So before we invite Via also to select some of the questions, I have a question for you, because I have your book, and I really appreciate a lot the effort of developing such a systematic review in terms of the three different dimensions that you mentioned, paradoxes, possibilities, and propositions, and also these, let's say, statements that are also kind of provocative in a way. And I like this one very much that you actually showed. Everyone knows what it is, public space, and no one knows what it is. I think it says, many things for those that are into public space research or public space implementation, because actually, when we talk about public space, as you said, we talk about humans and these humane dimensions. So also this idea of caring about these very important collective dimension is something that should be understood in a proper way. And the establishment of a proper culture related to public space, it is not so easy. I mean, not something that we can take for granted. What do you think, Vikas?
Yeah, I think the care has been actually more recently talked about quite a bit in terms of public space. Not only care for public space, but the idea of care that comes from public space. So caring for public space and mechanisms for doing that. I think there's caring at many, many levels. One is, of course, thinking about caring for public space that you can, in fact, do within your reach. Perhaps it's within your neighborhood. It's a park, or sidewalk in front of you. But then there's also sort of the larger caring of public space, which means that taking your voice to the politicians to be able to demand that public space be cared for, and not only be cared for in a ways that I talked about in many slides that are with capital, right? We see derelict public spaces being taken up and cleaned up and given back to the city, if you will, but in ways that it is completely not recognizable. So my sort of call would be to think about caring for public space at multiple levels. Some things citizens, residents can do by themselves, either individually or collectively, but other things need for us to actually take a political role and bring this up to our civic leaders, whether it is our community councils, city council, and sort of make them aware of the fact that sometimes public space that is seen as being revitalized and now cared for is actually not, because it gets taken away from the community. It's a great topic. I think it has at many levels, but I'm glad you bring it up, because this is almost an area where individuals have to act to do something on their own for public space. It's not in public space you use it, but you also have to care for it in ways that are either direct or indirect.
Well, absolutely. I think, everyone is part of the process of making public space attractive, welcoming, inclusive, equitable. So it is a call to action for everyone. And then, of course, we need to reach political leaders and decision makers, because also implementation of well-designed and well-managed public spaces is related to the everyday, management from city councils and municipalities. This is the crucial part. And with this Public Space Academy, we would actually reach that kind of consciousness that is pushing the agenda of local governments into the public space discourse. I think I saw some of the questions, so I'm inviting Via now to the stream to actually select some of the questions for us.
Yes, of course. I just wanted to start by saying that we've had a great turnout today with people from all over the world. I've seen people from Colombia, the United States, different countries in Europe, from South Africa, from Qatar. So great to have everybody here. And we're having also an interesting turnout in the questions. So let me just start by sharing one over here, for example, from Daniel, who's asking, here in 2024, what do you see, Vikas, as the largest challenges or threats to increasing the amount, quality, and support of public space in cities?
So I believe this is from Lance J. Brown, who's posted several things here. And I've met Lance many, many years ago with Michael Sorkin. So I think you also mentioned, Lance, that you were part of the Occupy movement. I know you were sort of a key figure in collecting that book together about Zuccotti Park. So I appreciate your comments here. I think they're very interesting. Let's talk about the question here, which is largest challenges or threats to increasing the amount, quality, and support of public spaces. So I think the largest challenges, in my opinion, are the way that capital is seeing public space and is using public space. At the same time, it has brought the 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 value of public space very clear and open to everyone. What is perhaps unfortunate is that what it has highlighted is the economic value of public space foremost. It doesn't mean it has not highlighted other aspects of public space, but what people are seeing in city governments and councils, that when they have invested in public space, they've got economic return. But there are other things that I think need to be seen in that, which is what is the other value of public space in terms of cohesion? Or are there, in fact, challenges that are not addressed by this sort of revitalization of public space to bring in economic development around, to bring in more revenue, which is a very common example, at least in cities in the US. Every city has developed their sort of key park or key plaza as the space that they put up on their posters. It's kind of the image space. But the challenges are, how is that space performing? How is it acting in way of displacing people, and so on and so forth? And one of the ideas that I have in here, which comes from a couple of cities that I've lived in the US, is that there are possible partnerships that are outside of the development corporations or developers themselves, partnerships with health organizations. You know, health is a big thing in the US. Of course, there are these big institutional entities that occupy large parts of space in the city. Interacting with them to be able to become um, almost like caretakers of public space, because public space has a direct relationship with health. um, that might be another one way. That's only one way I'm suggesting. The other thing that I find perhaps a way out of this is to think about public space as a collective domain, which is a network to fight against the climate crisis. And if I think that voice is still not yet very audible, it will get audible when we start to realize that this is upon us, and we can actually do things with public space if we understand it as a collective common, to be able to mitigate some of that.
Yeah, thank you for this. I think that this notion of the changing perception of what public space is and how to approach it leads us very nicely to another question that we have here from a user on LinkedIn, but I don't have the name, sadly, who asks about the change of teaching about public space. Is there a change in focus or the way that new professionals in this domain are prepared?
I can say a little bit about it. I don't know the entirety of this, but I think um, there is certainly a lot more recognition of public space, whether it is directly about teaching about public space or it's about teaching about some aspect of planning the city, um, because it has been visible to us in the last, I don't know, 12, 14, 15 years, right from the time of, now again, public space has been relevant all along, but it has become much, much more visible perhaps, and I see it as being more visibly relevant now, starting with, you know, the unrest in the Middle East, and then Occupy and all of that, and then recently with George Floyd's murder. So I think that this is very front and center. I can also say from what I see here in our school is the discussion with public space and the city in general when we talk about uh, diversity, equity, and inclusion. You know, that's a big thing, at least in the US universities and other institutions. So I would see that indirectly, at least, there is much more emphasis on public space. I don't know directly if there is more course work or more parts of courses that are discussing this or not, but I certainly hope so.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question. So I will share a question from our friend Oscar from Colombia, who's asking about the importance of public space as a source of meaning. If you could elaborate on that a bit.
Yes, I think that's a really good question, because when we think about economics, we think about interaction, we might even think about, aspects of health and well-being. We sometimes forget about the sort of the meaning that develops, that sort of collects over time. And I think that was one of my first slides, that public space is a place, it's a repository of memories and meanings. This is obviously much harder to communicate in policy, but it is something that people in the built environment disciplines can understand. People in many of the social science disciplines can actually understand. And meaning is attached, I think, in many ways in public space. Meaning is very interesting and it's very complex. Meaning can be direct to that particular public space that you used, visited, you come back to, you have memories of it. But it can also be very relational. Certain things that you did in a public space bring you memories of another place and attach meaning to it. And I think that those aspects are very critical in thinking about public space. Again, in my slideshow, the mention of that was only a couple times, but it's certainly a very important source in terms of meaning, just not for the individual, but also meaning for larger groups and society as a whole.
Thank you very, very much. Yes. So I think we're approaching the time limit for us today. So I will invite Luisa back to give some maybe closing remarks.
Yes, I think it was a great opportunity to share reflections on public space. And thank you, Vikas, for joining us. I hope we will have you again during multiple sessions that we are organizing for the Public Space Academy. Because it's not just about lecturing. The Academy is also about starting a dialogue and interact with the public space scholars, professionals, community leaders, and to really establish a platform for discussion and learning. So I appreciate also the participation of so many people from the audience, your interests, your questions. I think this was a great start, as I said. So thank you again, Vikas, and we will ask to join us again in the future. And I also thank you, Via, for moderating. So to the next lecture, which will be in February and will be announced soon on our social media channels. Thank you all for joining.
Thank you. Thank you, Via. Thank you, Luisa. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.